There are moments when the truth doesn't knock before entering your life. It crashes through the door, takes everything you thought you knew, and leaves you standing there, wondering whether the future you were building was ever real. The Sifta Septus Kaboman. I thought I knew the woman I was going to marry. I trusted her. I imagined our life together. I had already started making room for her in a future I had spent years dreaming about. Then my sister looked at me, with tears in her eyes, and, told me something about my future wife that I never expected to hear. And in that single moment, everything I believed about love, trust, and the woman I was preparing to call my wife began to fall apart. Monday, I still remember the way my sister said my name. It wasn't casual. It wasn't the way she normally called me when she wanted to tell me something small or ask me for a favor. There was fear in her voice. There was hesitation. She stood there for a few seconds like she was fighting with herself, trying to decide whether telling me would save me or destroy me. And finally she said, "You need to know something before you marry her." Those words changed the atmosphere in the room. You know that feeling when your heart suddenly understands that something is wrong before your mind even knows what it is? I felt it immediately. I wanted to interrupt her. I wanted to tell her that she was mistaken. I wanted to protect the woman I loved from whatever accusation was coming. Because when you love someone, your first instinct is often to defend them, even before you know what you're defending them from. Then I looked at my sister and said, "What are you talking about?" "Oh," she looked down, and then she told me the secret. I won't pretend that I handled it perfectly. I didn't. My first reaction was anger. Not just anger toward my sister, but anger toward the entire situation. I wondered why she had waited. I wondered why she had gotten involved. I wondered whether someone had filled her head with lies. I wondered whether she was trying to destroy the happiest thing that had happened to me in years. Because that's what fear does. When the truth threatens something we desperately want, we don't always ask whether the truth is real. Sometimes we ask how we can make it disappear. And that was exactly where I found myself. Minda had already imagined the wedding. I had imagined standing beside her, looking into her eyes, promising that I would be there through every season of life. I had imagined the ordinary things too, morning conversations, grocery shopping, arguments about where to eat, laughing over something completely stupid, coming home after a difficult day and knowing there would be someone waiting who felt like home. Banja, that is the dangerous thing about building a future in your mind. Man, you don't just fall in love with the person, you fall in love with the life you imagine having with them, and when something threatens that future, it feels like someone is not just taking a person away from you. It feels like they are taking an entire life you already emotionally lived. My sister kept talking, but I could barely process the words. I was hearing her, but my mind was somewhere else. I was remembering every conversation I had ever had with my future wife, every smile, every promise. Every moment when I thought she was being completely honest with me, and suddenly, all those memories looked different. That's one of the cruelest parts of discovering a hidden truth. It doesn't only change the present. It makes you question the past. You start wondering, was that moment real? Was she telling me the truth then? What else don't I know? Or who have I actually been loving? And those questions can become louder than the truth itself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying my sister's words over and over again. Part of me wanted to call my future wife immediately. Another part of me was terrified of hearing her answer. Because once you ask a question like that, you can't take it back. Once the truth comes into the room, you cannot force it back into hiding. I picked up my phone more than once. I typed her name, I stared at it, then I put the phone down. Because I realized something. I wasn't ready to hear the answer, not because I didn't want the truth. Because I was afraid the truth would require me to change everything. And that's when I understood something about human nature. We often say we want the truth. But what we really want is a truth that doesn't cost us anything. We want honesty as long as honesty doesn't threaten our comfort. We want answers as long as the answers don't force us to make painful decisions. But real truth doesn't care about our plans. It doesn't care how much time we've invested. It doesn't care how beautiful the future looked in our imagination. Truth simply arrives, and when it arrives, you have a choice. You can run from it. You can attack the person who brought it to you. You can pretend you never heard it. Bands, or you can stand still and face it. I wish I could tell you I immediately chose courage. I didn't. Jandy, at first, I chose denial. I told myself my sister misunderstood. I told myself there had to be another explanation. I told myself the woman I loved would never hide something important from me. And maybe you've done something like that too. Maybe someone warned you about a relationship and you defended it because you had already invested too much emotionally. Maybe you saw signs but explained them away. Maybe your heart noticed things your mind refused to accept. Because when we desperately want something to be true, we can become experts at explaining away what hurts. So, we say they're just busy, they've been under pressure, they didn't mean it, they'll change. Tell the under pressure? They'll change. They're different with me. Sometimes those things are true. And sometimes they're simply stories we tell ourselves because the alternative hurts too much. Bland. But there was something different about what my sister told me. She wasn't gossiping. She wasn't smiling. Bam. She wasn't enjoying my pain. She looked genuinely broken by what she had to say. And that forced me to listen. She told me she had known about this secret for longer than I realized. She had struggled with whether she should tell me, because she knew how much I loved this woman. She knew I was planning a future. She knew that telling me could create a fracture between all of us. And then she said something I will never forget. Mandra, she said, I would rather have you hate me for telling you the truth than watch you marry someone without knowing what you're walking into. And that sentence stayed with me because sometimes love doesn't look like protecting someone's happiness. Sometimes love looks like protecting them from a decision they are making without the information they deserve. And suddenly I began to understand why my sister had waited. She wasn't trying to destroy my relationship. She was trying to make sure I entered marriage with my eyes open. But even then, I wasn't ready to accept everything. I needed to hear it from the woman I loved. Ambience, not because I automatically trusted one person over another. Because I knew that if I was going to make a decision that would change my entire life, I needed to give the person at the center of the story a chance to speak. So the next morning, I called her, she answered. I heard her voice, and for a few seconds, everything felt normal. Benders, she asked me what was wrong. I wanted to say nothing. I wanted to pretend. I wanted to hear her laugh and convince myself that the night before had been some terrible dream. But I couldn't, so I asked her one question. Abenda. And the moment I asked it, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Not a normal silence. Not the silence of someone trying to remember something. Lenja, it was the silence of someone who already knew exactly what I was talking about. Gent. And in that silence, before she even answered, I felt my heart begin to break. And in that silence, before she even answered, I felt my heart begin to break. Because sometimes the silence before an answer tells you more than the answer itself. I heard her breathe, and then she said, who told you? Not, what are you talking about? That's not true. What did you hear? She asked, who told you? And that question hit me harder than anything my sister had said. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. I remember thinking, so it's true, maybe not every detail. Maybe not the story exactly as my sister had told it. But there was something there. Something she had chosen not to tell me, and suddenly, all the confidence I'd carried into that conversation disappeared. I asked her why she never told me. She didn't answer immediately. Commander, then she said something that made the situation even more complicated. She told me she was afraid. Benti, afraid that if I knew the truth, I would look at her differently, afraid that I would leave. And afraid that everything we had built would disappear in one conversation. And for the first time, I realized that sometimes people hide things not because they don't care about you, but because they are terrified of what honesty might cost them. That doesn't make hiding the truth right, but it makes the human heart easier to understand. I asked her, did you ever plan to tell me? She said, I wanted to, I asked when, and she couldn't give me an answer. That hurt. Thus, because I was going to tell you can become one of the most painful sentences in a relationship when the truth is something you deserve to know. Before making a lifelong commitment, I sat there listening to her explain herself, and part of me wanted to forgive her immediately. Another part of me was furious. Another part wanted to hang up. Another part wanted to believe that love could somehow erase what had happened, but love doesn't erase truth. Gaspre, and marriage should never be built on information. One person is allowed. The doubts. To hide while the other person is expected to trust blindly. And Binger, so I asked her to tell me everything, not what she thought I could handle. Bands not what would make her look better. Everything. There was another silence. Then she began, and as she spoke, I realized something that changed the way I saw the entire situation. Man, the secret wasn't simply about what had happened. It was about why she had hidden it. And sometimes the reason someone hides something tells you as much as the secret itself. Fancy told me about a part of her past she had never shared with me, a chapter she was ashamed of, a decision she had made years before we met, a situation that had left consequences she was still carrying. She had convinced herself that because it happened before me, I had no right to know, but I disagreed. Lengen, not because I believed a person should be judged forever by their past. I disagreed because marriage is not simply a promise about the future. It is a promise to enter the future. Honestly. Your past doesn't have to be perfect. Neither does mine. Nobody walks into love without scars. We all have chapters we wish we could rewrite. We all have mistakes we wish we could undo. Venda, we all have moments when we were younger, weaker, more confused, or simply human. But the person you marry deserves a chance to decide whether they can accept your whole story. Mindian, not the edited version, not the polished version, not the version designed to guarantee that they stay. The whole person, Bamanda's the whole story, the truth. And as she continued speaking, I realized that my anger was changing. It wasn't disappearing. It was becoming something deeper, disappointment, because I could understand her fear, Linda. But I couldn't ignore what her fear had done to me. Kalan, she had taken away my ability to make an informed decision. Blaine, she had allowed me to build a future without knowing something that might have changed that future. And that is where trust becomes complicated. People often think trust is simply about whether someone cheats or lies. Belinda, it's bigger than that. Building trust is knowing that the person beside you will give you the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Trust is knowing that they won't decide what you deserve. To know based on what they think you can handle. Trust is knowing that your relationship can survive difficult conversations. And if the relationship cannot survive the truth, then perhaps the relationship was never as strong as you believed. Mindy, I told her I needed time. She started crying. She asked if I was leaving, and there it was. Millions, the question I had been trying to avoid. Was I going to leave? I didn't know. And maybe that was the most honest answer I could give. Lands. Because there are moments when people expect you to make an immediate decision simply because the truth has finally arrived. But not every decision needs to be made in the first emotional moment. Sometimes you need to breathe. Sometimes you need to sleep. Dan, sometimes you need to step away from everyone else's opinions and listen to your own conscience. My sister wanted me to protect myself. My future wife wanted me to understand her. And I was standing between two people I loved trying to figure out what was right. That was when I realized something. The goal wasn't to choose my sister over my future wife. The goal wasn't to choose my future wife over my sister. The goal was to choose the truth. Dance. Because when you choose truth, you don't need to turn everyone into a villain. Vanda, you don't need to destroy one person to defend another. You don't need to create enemies just because you're hurting. You simply ask, what is real? Pomdia, and then you decide what you can live with. You can live. That night, I met my future wife in person. We sat across from each other, and for the first time since I had known her, I didn't look at her through the eyes of a man planning a wedding. I looked at her as a human being, a complicated human being, a woman with fears, a woman with regrets. meant a woman who had made choices, a woman who had been afraid of losing me, and I realized that I had also been doing something unfair. I had placed her on a pedestal. Then I had imagined her as the perfect woman who would finally give me the perfect future. Amandia. But no human being can live inside another person's perfect imagination. She wasn't perfect. Neither was I. So man, the real question was whether we could be honest enough to build something real. I asked her one final question. Menjin, I said, if I had never found out, would you have ever told me? She looked at me and she cried. But she didn't answer. That silence told me everything. And strangely, it also gave me peace. Because sometimes you don't get the answer you wanted. Sometimes you get the answer you needed. Man, I understood that my heartbreak wasn't only about the secret. Landers, it was about realizing that I had been preparing to marry a version of someone that didn't completely exist. And maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've loved an image. Maybe you've loved someone's potential. Amanda, maybe you've loved the version of them they showed you when everything was easy. But relationships are not tested when everything is beautiful. They're tested when truth walks into the room. Danda, when mistakes are exposed, when fear is revealed. Menja, when two people finally have to decide whether honesty is stronger than pride. Bayan, and I had to make that decision too. I could punish her forever. I could leave immediately. I could pretend nothing happened. Means or I could slow down and ask whether trust could ever be rebuilt. That was the hardest question. Because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can forgive someone and still need time. You can understand why someone lied and still be hurt by the lie. You can love someone and still decide that marriage is not the right choice. And that doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. Mandy, I told her that if we were going to continue, there could be no more hidden rooms in our relationship. Blender, no more secrets waiting for the right moment. Lemmienjin, no more carefully edited truths. No more deciding for each other what we were allowed to know. I told her that I didn't need a perfect woman. I needed an honest one. And I realized something about myself too. Menda, I didn't need to be a perfect man. But I needed to become a man capable of hearing an uncomfortable truth without immediately destroying everything around him. That was the beginning of the real conversation, not the wedding conversation, not the romantic conversation, the human conversation. We talked for hours about fear, about shame, about trust, about the past, about what marriage actually means. And slowly something unexpected happened. The secret that had almost destroyed us began forcing us to become honest in ways we had never been before. But honesty alone could not decide our future. We still had a choice to make, and that choice would change everything, because by that point, I understood that the question was no longer simply whether I could forgive her. The deeper question was whether I could trust her again, and whether we could build a marriage where the truth was no longer something either of us was afraid to speak. I went home that night with no answer, and for the first time in weeks, I stopped thinking about the wedding. I stopped thinking about the invitations, the plans, the future I had already imagined. I sat alone and asked myself a harder question. If I stay, can I stay without secretly punishing her for what happened? Because there is no point in saying you forgive someone while keeping a private record of every mistake they have ever made. That isn't forgiveness. That's a sentence with a delayed execution, And if I left, I asked myself another question. Would I be leaving because the relationship was truly impossible, or because I was afraid to take the difficult road of rebuilding trust? Then there was no easy answer. But somewhere in that silence, I realized that love is not proven when everything goes according to plan. Love is tested when the plan falls apart. The next morning, I called my sister. I thanked her. Not because she had made my life easier. She hadn't. Blender's not because I was suddenly happy about what she had told me. I wasn't. I thanked her because she had been willing to risk my anger. To make sure I knew the truth before I made a lifelong decision. She cried when I said it, then she told me something I had never considered. Ban, she said, I didn't tell you because I wanted to control your decision. I told you because I wanted the decision to actually belong to you. That sentence changed the way I saw everything. Banned, because sometimes love is not about making decisions for people. Man, it's about giving them the truth and trusting them to make their own decisions. Ben and my sister didn't need me to choose her side. She needed me to have all the information, and my future wife didn't need me to pretend her past never happened. A man, she needed me to decide whether I could love her knowing the truth. So I went back into my future wife. I told her I was still hurt. I told her that trust would not return because we had one emotional conversation. And I told her that if we were going to continue, we would have to rebuild everything slowly, and she agreed. There was no dramatic promise that everything would suddenly be perfect. There was simply a decision to be honest. Oh, and sometimes that's where real healing begins, not with a grand speech, not with a perfect apology. But with two people saying, I don't know exactly how we're going to fix this, but I'm willing to do the work. We postponed the wedding. That decision hurt. People asked questions. Some people judged us. Some thought we had broken up. Melinda, others thought postponing the wedding meant the relationship was already finished. Belenja, but they didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. They didn't know that postponing the wedding was not necessarily postponing our love. It was protecting our future. Manda, because a wedding is one day, a marriage is a lifetime. And I would rather delay one beautiful day than rush into decades of unresolved pain. We began having difficult conversations. Manda's real ones, the kind of conversations people often avoid until they have no choice. We talked about expectations, boundaries, family, the money, past mistakes, fear, trust, communication. Laminges, we talked about the things that made us feel loved and the things that made us feel invisible, And I learned something I wish more people understood before getting married. You don't marry someone's potential. Bana, you marry the person standing in front of you. So you need to know who that person actually is. Banstons, not who you hope they will become, not who you imagine they could be. Mend, not who they are when they're trying to impress you. Who are they when they're scared? Foundit, who are they when they're angry? Who are they when they are wrong? Mund, who are they when nobody is watching? And because that's the person you are building a life with. Kike, and I had almost married an incomplete version of someone because I was so excited about the future that I stopped asking difficult questions about the present. That was my mistake too. Women had been so focused on being loved that I had forgotten that being truly known is part of love. And being known means allowing someone to see the parts of you that are not polished. Like the parts you are ashamed of, the parts you are still healing, the parts you wish had never happened. Not because your past defines you, but because honesty gives the other person the freedom to decide whether they can walk beside you. But eventually something changed between us, not overnight, not magically, slowly. She stopped being afraid to tell me difficult things, and I stopped reacting as if every difficult truth was an attack. Manjan, we learned how to disagree without destroying each other. We learned how to ask questions without assuming the worst. Bibanger, we learned how to listen without immediately defending ourselves. And that changed our relationship more than any romantic moment ever had. Because before The Secret came out, I thought love meant never hurting each other. MD and LD. After The Secret came out, I understood that love means learning how to handle hurt without becoming enemies. There is a difference. Every relationship will face painful moments. Every couple will eventually discover something they didn't expect. Every person will eventually disappoint the person they love. The question is not whether pain will happen. No. The question is what you do when it arrives. Do you hide? Do you lie? Yeah. Do you attack? Ben, do you run? Or do you sit down and tell the truth? Mandance, that's where relationships are either strengthened or destroyed. Months passed. And during that time, I realized I was no longer asking whether my future wife had a perfect past. I was asking whether she had an honest present. That was the question that mattered. Bands, because nobody can change what happened years ago, but people can change what they do today. And I saw change, not because I demanded perfection, because she understood that trust had to be earned again. She became more transparent, more patient, more willing to answer difficult questions, and I had to do my part too. Jen, I had to stop punishing her for a mistake she had already admitted. Meant I had to learn the difference between remembering and holding something over someone's head. That wasn't easy. And there were moments when the old fear returned. Well, there were moments when one small thing would remind me, of the secret, and I would feel that old pain again. Jen, but instead of pretending I was fine, I learned to speak, and instead of becoming defensive, she learned to listen. That became our new language, truth, not perfection, truth. And eventually, we made a decision. We would still get married. Menja. But this time, I wasn't marrying the woman I thought she was. I was choosing the woman I now knew. Dan, the real woman, the complicated woman, the woman with a past, the woman who had made mistakes. Mend, the woman who had been afraid, the woman who had hurt me, and the woman who was willing to rebuild what she had damaged. And maybe that is one of the deepest meanings of love. Not loving someone because they have never failed you. Jens, but knowing who they really are and deciding with open eyes whether you can build something honest together. Land, when our wedding day finally came, I looked at her differently, not with the innocent certainty I had once had. Mans, with something stronger, awareness. I knew her story, she knew mine. There were no perfect illusions between us anymore, and somehow that made the moment more meaningful. Kalendas, because we weren't standing there promising to love imaginary versions of each other. Jand, we were promising to love two imperfect human beings who had decided to keep choosing honesty. Lynn, I thought about my sister that day too. I thought about the conversation that had almost destroyed my world, and I realized something strange. The truth had broken the future I imagined. Fans, but it gave us the chance to build a future that was real. Sometimes the thing that feels like the end is actually the moment illusion ends, and when illusion ends, truth begins. That doesn't mean every relationship should survive a secret. Some secrets reveal things that cannot be repaired. Manda, some betrayals should become boundaries. Some relationships need to end, and nobody should be pressured to stay, simply because they once loved someone. But sometimes the truth reveals something painful without making the relationship impossible. Sometimes it reveals a person who is flawed but willing to change. Sometimes it reveals a relationship that needs honesty more than romance. And sometimes it teaches you that forgiveness is not weakness. It is a decision to stop allowing the past to control the future. DMEMG. The most important thing I learned from that experience is that love without honesty becomes a performance. You can have beautiful pictures, beautiful promises, beautiful plans, beautiful words, Jans. But if the truth has no place in the relationship, sooner or later the entire thing becomes fragile. And because secrets don't disappear, they wait, and eventually they ask to be heard. So if you're listening to me today and there is under the person, something you are afraid to tell the person you love, ask yourself, are you protecting them? Or are you protecting yourself from the consequences? There is a difference, and if someone you love has revealed something painful about their past, don't immediately decide what their entire character is based on one chapter. Listen, ask questions, look at their actions today, ask whether they are taking responsibility. Ask whether they are willing to rebuild trust. Because people are more than their worst moment, GN, but they are also responsible for what they do with that moment afterward. And if you're the person carrying a secret right now, understand this. The truth may cost you something. Banes, it may cost you comfort. It may cost you certainty. It may even cost you a relationship. But living honestly gives you something no secret can give you: peace. Vengeance, because when you stop managing people's perceptions and start living in truth, you no longer have to remember which version of the story you told to whom. So Amendia, you can breathe, you can be known, you can be loved for who you actually are, and if someone chooses to walk away after hearing the truth, that will hurt. Oh, but at least they walked away from the real you, not from a character you created to keep them close, you know? And if they stay, then you know something powerful. They stayed with their eyes open. That's real love. Benja. So when I look back at the night my sister told me the secret, I no longer see only the moment my world fell apart. I see the moment my illusion fell apart, and those are not the same thing. My world was not destroyed. Abayanda, my false certainty, was destroyed. My fantasy was destroyed. Manda, the version of the future I had created in my head, was destroyed. You know, and after the dust settled, I had the opportunity to build something stronger, something honest, something real. Man is something that could survive the truth, because the truth did not end our story. Man, it forced us to finally start living it honestly, you know? And maybe that's what you need to remember when life reveals something you never expected. Not every truth is the end. Sometimes the truth is an invitation to grow, an invitation to communicate, stands an invitation to forgive, an invitation to set boundaries, an invitation to leave, an invitation to begin again. Demands, but whatever you do, don't build your future on a lie simply because the truth is uncomfortable. Menerme's comfort can protect you for a moment, truth can protect you for a lifetime. No. And if you are standing in a situation right now where your heart night is broken because someone you love wasn't completely honest with you, take a breath. And you don't have to decide everything today. You don't have to forgive immediately. Maitlinda, you don't have to leave immediately. You don't have to stay immediately. You have permission to pause. Maniez, you have permission to think. You have permission to ask questions. You have permission to protect your heart. You know, and you also have permission to love someone who made a mistake if you genuinely believe trust can be rebuilt. Ma'am, the choice is yours. Just make sure it is your choice, not your family's, not your friends, not society's. Yours, because at the end of the day, you are the one who has to live inside the decision, you know? And if there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this, you know, don't be afraid of the truth. You know, be afraid of building a lifetime around something that isn't true. Lands, because the truth may break your heart for a season, but a lie can quietly break your life for years. You know, and sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on to someone. Mance, sometimes it is having the courage to see them clearly, to see yourself clearly. You know, and then with open eyes and an honest heart, decide what comes next. That is where real love begins.